Margaret stared, horrified at the splintered shards of glass. Her father's treasured rose bowl, the only big gardening prize he'd ever won. Now that was gone too. He'd been dead 2 years, but still his presence was everywhere in the house they had shared all Margaret's life. The garden had been his pride and joy. Margaret often wandered around it, seeing her father's touch everywhere. She tried to keep it much as it had been. Alzheimer's disease had raced into his brain with cruel speed, robbing him of his senses and her of the father she adored. Almost overnight, it had seemed, their roles had been reversed. She the parent, he the child. It had all been too much for her fiancé, handsome, upwardly mobile, shallow Matthew. She had adored him too, had believed in their bright future together. But Matthew's plans had not included a father-in-law who might linger on for years, demanding and embarrassing, needing constant care and attention. So, with only a casual phone call, Matthew had broken off their engagement and vanished. Margaret had buried her broken heart and wounded pride deep inside. She nursed her father with patience and love, and when he eventually died, she felt only relief that it was over. She had done her grieving years before. Now she was almost 40. She had no real friends, only acquaintances, and few of them. Even the people she passed every day as she cycled along the towpath would only nod or smile in greeting. Margaret liked it that way. She had lived among canal people all her life. She was used to their comings and goings, their noise and colour. The canal was an integral part of her, and she loved it in all its moods. Cycling beside it each day gave her a sense of belonging that she otherwise had learned to live without. She was lucky, of course, to have the time to take pleasure in her surroundings and to indulge her interest in the wild things that lived there. Her father had left her financially secure, and she continued to run their shop in the village more as a hobby than as a living. She opened and closed as she wished, and the locals had become used to the curio shop's erratic hours. When the sun shone and the air was gentle, she would dawdle a little longer, cycle a little further. She knew every bend in the canal, every dip in the path, every boat that had permanent moorings, and she always noted the new arrivals. His sudden appearance made her jump. She didn't quite know whether to move away or stay. She felt awkward, and the dog was a welcome diversion. She fussed over it a little, to give her limbs time to stop shaking and her pulse a chance to slow down. Where had he come from, she wondered, this tall, young, rather good-looking stranger? Was he an overnighter? A holiday maker? She liked to put people in their pigeonholes. He caught her looking searchingly at him and with a smile offered her a cup of tea. Suddenly realizing that she'd been staring, she instinctively muttered her refusal and started to move away. There was no real reason to refuse, except that she always did. But now that it was too late, she really wished she had said yes. Of all the curiosities Margaret collected and sold in her shop, she loved the books the best. The pretty knickknacks, the things that caught her eye, those went to the front of the shop to draw the customers. But the books were special. She savoured the intimate messages written on fly leaves, the feel of old leather bindings, the smell of ancient pages. For a second, she thought she was imagining him standing there. He was as surprised as she, though he recovered quickly, taking her to the door to see Lucy waiting outside. She invited him to look round, but he knew what he wanted, a specific book about the canal trade years ago, with a special section on traditional decoration. Reading the card, she was delighted to know that she had a copy, and as she turned away to find it, she realized she felt shaky and her cheeks felt hot. She could feel his eyes on her as she searched the shelves. Had he guessed that she knew perfectly well where the book was, that she was simply delaying, stretching out the moment before he would leave? Embarrassed by her own devious thoughts, she took the book from the shelf and handed it to him. He smiled up at her before delightedly turning the pages, exclaiming over photographs of places beside the canal that he had seen, places he was sure she must know too. His enthusiasm was infectious, and she felt herself relaxing a little. By the time he left, she knew his name was Cal, that he was a herbalist, that his boat was his home, and all about Lucy. Talking with him had been so easy. Now, as they parted, he seemed about to say more, then thought better of it. As she watched him go, she felt such a lightening of spirit that she wanted to laugh out loud, so she quickly turned inside before she could give in to such idiocy. In the morning, Cal, like most boat people, was up and about early. Margaret was too. She'd hardly slept. She had delayed her customary cycle ride while she debated endlessly with herself over the route she should take. Was it wise to take the towpath? She hoped, of course, that she would see Cal again, but she was terrified that he would sense her motive and think her ridiculous, a silly old maid. As she came close to the boat, she knew it was now or never. Taking her courage in both hands, she stopped beside him. She admired his handiwork, and when he asked her to stay for a coffee, she hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Inside, the boat was as attractive as it was outside. Margaret looked round while Cal made coffee in the galley. On the side was the book she'd sold him. Idly, she turned the cover and found a card inside. To Kathy. Lots of love, Cal. As if burned, she slapped it shut. Kathy. Who was Kathy? Although the question still lingered, she was determined not to show it as they sat together, sipping coffee and feeling the day growing warm around them. She told herself that it hardly mattered if Kathy was his girlfriend, past or present, since Margaret certainly wasn't. But she could enjoy his company, hold a few precious moments in her heart, perhaps be his friend, at least until he moved on. Walking away from him, knowing she would be back, she shrugged off her usual caution, ignored the warning voices and welcomed the feeling of elation that seized her. She suddenly realized she felt alive again, as she had in the old days, and that was enough for now. Last night, Cal had appeared at the back door, Lucy bounding beside him in the shadows of the garden. He had invited Margaret to go with him on a trip down the canal for the whole day, starting as early as she could make it. He couldn't have known, of course, how perfect the invitation was. It was her 40th birthday. Ever since her father's illness, all such events had passed unnoticed and unremarked. And this all-important year, this day which apparently divided youth from age, would have slipped by with nothing to make it any different from any other. But now it might be special, a time to remember for the rest of her life. Cal had obviously been waiting and was anxious to be off. The boat moved gently out into the canal. Although Cal hadn't mentioned Cathy, Margaret couldn't help wondering about her and how she fitted into Cal's life. But for today, she decided she wouldn't think about her. She would just give in to the dreamlike quality of the day. She had lived all her life beside the canal, but her father had never owned a boat, and she had rarely been on one. Cal teased her gently for being such a novice, as he guided her hand on the tiller and the throttle. And Margaret was a quick and willing pupil. By the time they had negotiated 2 locks, Margaret was becoming quite proficient at hopping off the boat and throwing her weight against the gates. With the sun warm on her head, she watched Cal negotiate expertly into the lock. Then, with delighted confidence, she tackled the sluices. She couldn't put a foot wrong. It was the most wonderful day of her life. She wasn't sorry, though, when Cal moored the narrowboat and the drone of the engine stopped, allowing them to sit and enjoy the peace of their surroundings. A peace that was almost immediately shattered by Lucy jumping into the water after the ducks. Cal shot out of the boat after her, knowing that she wouldn't be able to climb the wall and get back onto the path. Margaret was right behind him. Hauling Lucy back onto the bank, Cal tried to apologize to Margaret for the dog's behavior. Margaret, though, was too busy being soaked by Lucy to pay much attention, and anyway, she couldn't stop laughing. Cal was laughing too, as he helped her to her feet. And then, quite naturally, they came together. Cal had prepared a simple meal, and although Margaret was really too happy to eat much, she sipped some wine and picked at the bread and cheese, and glowed with the pleasure of being with him. When they'd finished, Cal gathered the dishes. Margaret was feeling as happy and carefree as she could ever remember being, as she followed him inside. Then she saw the photos, and her heart sank. Was this the girl in his life? Was this Cathy? Now the shop stayed closed more often than it used to, while Margaret spent what time she could on the boat with Cal. Their friendship strengthened daily, but Margaret wouldn't allow herself to hope for anything more. She hadn't asked Cal about the girl in the photo, although she had started to several times. It was, after all, none of her business, and truthfully, she thought she might not want to know the answer. Cal needed to go into town to buy a new valve for the water pump. It was the first time he'd left her alone on the boat, and she felt that this was another sign of his confidence in her. He was so tall that he dwarfed her bike, looking wobbly and ill at ease, and she couldn't help giggling. Being around Cal meant being around boats, and Margaret longed to become as expert with them as he was. With him safely out of the way, she decided to rehearse the start-up procedure. The noise was tremendous, but she wasn't certain what she could safely do next. One of the mooring ropes, sadly one that she had tied herself, began to slip. Margaret was so preoccupied, pushing buttons and wrestling with levers, that she didn't immediately notice either the retreating bank or the approaching stranger. By now, the boat was almost halfway across the canal, and Margaret was beginning to panic. She was miserably aware that if she couldn't get the narrowboat under control, Cal would come back and find her marooned like an idiot. But help was at hand.
Hey! Hey!
Margaret didn't hear the girl calling as she tried again to stop the engine, succeeding only in driving the stern even further out. It was only when she felt the boat stop drifting that she heard the girl's shouted command. She pushed the red button, although she was sure she had done it several times before. But this time the engine died, and the narrowboat was slowly drawn back to its berth. Margaret had scarcely had time to look at the stranger who had come to her aid. She was only grateful that someone who obviously knew about boats had been there. But when the girl asked where Cal was, and when her every movement clearly showed that she was no stranger, when she threw her bag on board and went to find him, then Margaret realized that this was the girl in the photo, Kathy. Not someone from Cal's past, but very much present. How stupid she'd been to have hoped, however remotely, for anything else. So that was that. She couldn't be there when they came back, the two of them, happy to be together again. With a cold and heavy heart, she automatically secured the doors, trying to leave the boat as though she had simply finished her tasks and gone home. She left Lucy to guard the other open door, reluctant to shut her in without knowing what Cal would want. Not that he would notice. He would be too busy with Kathy now to notice anything much. She'd almost reached the safety of her gate when she saw them. Momentarily mesmerized, she watched them, talking animatedly, laughing, walking close together, very much a couple. In a panic, she flew into the garden and flung herself into the familiar safety of her own four walls. The dream was over, before it had even begun. What a fool, what a stupid fool. She had known from the moment she saw the card in the book, the photo on the wall, that there was someone in Cal's life. And still she had gone on with her silly, romantic notions, all the time pretending it was merely friendship she wanted. Drawing the curtains against the brightness of the day, she saw them walking along the path and realized with horror that they were coming to return her bicycle. There was no way she could let them in. She couldn't smile and chat with them. Not yet, anyway. How could she have imagined that someone like Cal could ever have thought of her as more than a friend, and an older friend at that? As she spied on them from above, she knew that their relationship was not a casual one. They shared an easy intimacy that only comes with time. She ignored the insistent knocks on the door and waited, silent and rigid, for Cal to accept her absence and leave. She could only catch occasional glimpses of them now, as they moved around beneath her window, and though she could hear the murmur of their voices, she couldn't catch what they said. Why didn't he just leave the bike and take his little girlfriend, with her untidy, towny fashions, and just go? Had she felt like this when Matthew had left her? It was so long ago now she could hardly remember. She couldn't conjure up his face anymore. It was lost forever, replaced by Cal's. Another hopeless case to be slowly erased by time. How pathetic and sad she would have seemed to Cal and Kathy if they'd known anything of her foolish dreams. That one miraculous kiss had meant nothing more to Cal than the result of an unexpected moment of closeness. He would never know, that had meant so much more to her. Like an addict, knowing she would be hurt, she still couldn't resist peering round the hedge to see if they were on the boat. She must be mistaken. She must be. Cal had been there, in the garden, only half an hour before. But there was no mistake. Both he and the boat had gone. Well then, it would be that much easier to get back to normal, without seeing the boat from her bedroom window, without bumping into the pair of them each time she ventured outside her gate. Back to normal, and opening the shop would be a good way to start. But when it came to it, she couldn't do it. There seemed no point, absolutely no point at all. Deciding to drown her sorrows, she opened the bottle she had bought to share with Cal on the boat one evening. But the wine tasted like vinegar in her mouth, and she left it, going to her room to spend the night wide-eyed until dawn, when she fell into a restless doze. Feeling strong enough when she woke to face putting her bike away, she saw the paper bag lying there, and hardly daring to look, she read, "Taking my sister home, back tomorrow, love Cal." Love Cal. Sister. Sister! Kathy was his sister, not his girlfriend. He was back. The boat was moored and Cal was on it.
Cal!
In an instant, she made up her mind. No more pretense, no more holding back. She wouldn't let the chance slide again. She'd take the risk and tell him how much she cared.
The day Emma passed her test, she bought the car. She'd saved for it for years. It was her pride and joy. She couldn't use it very much in the city, where she shared a flat with Jill, so this was the longest drive she'd ever done. Her friendship with Jill seemed an unlikely one, on the face of it. Jill was streetwise, confident and outgoing. Emma, quite the reverse. But despite their differences, they enjoyed each other's company and shared a love of horse riding. So when the chance came for a week in a country cottage close to a riding stables, they jumped at it. Although Emma had plotted the route in meticulous detail before they left, Jill still kept getting it wrong. Naturally shy and quiet, Emma was starting to loosen up under the influence of Jill's extrovert, fun-loving nature. Unfortunately, machines can always be relied upon to be unreliable, and Emma's car was no exception. Just as they found the right route, they got a puncture. Emma had never changed a wheel before, although she knew the theory. She hadn't realized the spare was kept at the bottom of the boot, so first she had to empty out the entire contents of Jill's wardrobe, plus a makeup kit capable of servicing the cast of Dallas. Jill, as always, took a supervisory role. Busying herself with her already immaculate nails, her emery board came flying out whenever the prospect of hard work presented itself. Not for the first time, Emma was infuriated by Jill's ability to stand back and let others do the dirty work. She was just as angry with herself for always letting her get away with it. But that was the way it was. So, Emma got on with being Emma. She was too busy to hear the approaching Land Rover, but Jill was at the ready. The newcomer hardly had his foot on the ground before Jill switched into automatic flirt.
Probably do, Emma.
Emma made way for him, instantly feeling clumsy, awkward, and several sizes too large for her skin. He was quietly spoken and good-looking, and Emma was shocked to find herself staring at the way his hair curled round the nape of his neck. She glanced quickly at Jill to see if she had noticed, and of course she had. She'd always envied Jill her easy, outgoing way with strangers, and with men in particular, but today, inexplicably, she found Jill's usual performance unsubtle and rather embarrassing. Jill laughingly called him her knight in shining armor, and then rewarded his efforts with a kiss. Emma would never have done such a thing, but part of her wished she could, especially to Jack. Pulling herself together, Emma turned her back on the whole incident, and her good humor returned as they drove on. It was lovely. A perfect timbered cottage, nestling with its twin in a flowery tangle of a garden, surrounded by open countryside. An idyllic setting, just as the photo had promised. As Jill started to unload the bags, Emma went next door to collect the keys. There were 2 gates, but the garden seemed to be shared. It was alive with color and heady with perfume. It was him, right there on their doorstep. Shock, panic, delight, emotions tumbled over each other as Emma stuttered at him. And he, so calm, so friendly, handed over the keys with a smile to melt tarmac. Happy holiday. Well, only if Jack was one of a matching pair. Unpacked, clean again after the journey, Emma pottered about the kitchen in the rosy glow of the afternoon. Jill, of course, had better things to do. She tore herself away from the window where she'd been watching Jack chopping firewood.
Thank you. Okay.
Emma was trying to screw up enough courage to offer Jack a coffee. But she who hesitates is lost. As always, Jill had got there first. Too late. Oh, to be Jill just for this week. To be pretty and vivacious and certain of yourself, instead of trapped inside Emma. Emma, who wanted to be out in the sunlight, laughing with Jack, feeling the warmth of his interest. She was used to Jill's weakness for men, and she was used to the reaction of men to Jill. So why did she mind so much this time? Why did he have to live here, right next door? The whole week would be ruined now, with Jill being outrageous and Jack being besotted by her. Jill felt the chill in the air as soon as she came back in. she could hardly have avoided it, but she said nothing. Emma had never competed with her for anything, and certainly not for a man. Stifling a desire to push Jill aside, Emma grabbed her jacket and made for the door, shooting a look of pure poison at Jill's back. She closed the door with as much elegance as she could manage. Taking 3 deep breaths of calming country air, Emma set off across the garden, carefully ignoring Jack's abandoned work. Perhaps this place, with its peace and constancy, would put everything back in perspective again. After all, Jill was her friend. They'd been there for each other through fair men and foul, and never had they wanted the same one. She knew, of course, with absolute certainty and cold fury that Jill would have no lasting interest in Jack. He was too straightforward, too ordinary. For Jill, it would be a holiday diversion with a good-looking stranger, probably the only one in the area, too. But for Emma, the instant attraction was a first for her. The few relationships she'd had were based first on friendship, and she was shocked and knocked off balance by the strength of her feelings for Jack and her jealousy of Jill. Coming suddenly on a herd of deer, she paused, spellbound, to watch them. She was not the only one. She called out to him without a thought. It seemed quite natural to find him there in the park. But as she started down the slope, she felt her feet, still in her silly city boots, slide from under her. Oh God, she prayed as she hit the ground, let me just disappear, please. But Jack was solicitous and apparently unaware of her embarrassment. Once he knew she was unhurt, he was more interested in sharing his love of the deer and the parkland where they lived. Being so near to him made studying the deer rather difficult. Her hands trembled as they clutched the binoculars. Fortunately, the deer were less nervous than she and seemed unaffected by their presence. Jack proudly produced some photographs he had taken. She tried to concentrate on them, but she was so close to him she was sure he must hear the blood pounding in her ears. Perhaps, she dared to hope, perhaps there was still a chance. Jack and Emma wandered back through the gentle warmth of the evening, Emma basking in his friendliness. Her country roots had been starved in the city, but Jack's enthusiasm for his land was infectious, and she was as much carried along by their common love of nature as by the undeniable thrill of being alone with him. As they walked down the lane towards the cottage, Jack told Emma about a barn owl which had made its home in some outbuildings not far from here. His attempts at photographing it had been, so far, pretty unsuccessful, but it didn't matter. He loved just watching the bird hunt in the early evening. He asked if she'd like to go with him to try and see the owl one night. She nearly burst with happiness. She held lightly to the promise of another meeting with him as they walked up the path towards the front door. And Jill.
Hi, come on in. Come on.
Jill dressed to kill. She had her prey in through the door so fast he could hardly draw breath.
Oh, what a surprise. It's a new day. Come, sit down.
Look at her. Emma's heart sank into her boots. How could Jack fail to respond to those bright eyes, those laughing lips, full of such blatant promise? And listen to her, too, brushing aside the oh-so-dull details of the deer and the walk, asking him bold as brass where he's going that night. Emma rushed off to change her clothes for something more suitable for a drink in the pub. Not that she had a lot to choose from. She hated to leave them together, though she was sure neither of them would miss her. There was not time for a major overhaul. A patch-up job would have to do. Hair soft and casual for a start. The sound of Jack's voice and Jill's laughter echoed in her head as she hurried to change. She could almost see them, smiling, talking, Jill leaning towards him. She was almost ready. She knew that whatever she did, she would never be as pretty as Jill. And she heard the door. They were going without her. How could Jill do that? Jack wasn't to blame. He wouldn't have stood a chance against a determined Jill. But to leave without a word... She watched in disbelief as the Land Rover pulled away. Well, she decided, grimly finishing her lipstick, she'd go after them. She would not be shy about going into a pub on her own. She would not stay there like a naughty child left behind as a punishment. Then a straw to clutch at. Gone to pub up the road. Follow in the car when you're ready. See you later. Love, Jill. Quick, quick. She'll probably have eaten him by now. She tore down the path and flung herself into the car. Keys. Where were the keys? She rushed back to the house, heart hammering as minutes ticked away. More minutes when Jill would be alone with Jack. The keys must be there. She wouldn't have taken them. But she had. Utter hatred filled Emma's being and exploded as she spat her fury into the night.
You bitch!
Next morning, Jill's account of her evening with Jack painted a picture of two souls in perfect harmony. She neglected to mention that Jack had continually asked why Emma hadn't joined them, nor did she have any explanation for the reappearance of the car keys in Emma's bag that morning. Instead, she told Emma just how intelligent, how amusing, how attentive Jack had been. Emma, busying herself round the place as usual, tried to ignore her. She was finding it difficult to maintain any charitable feelings for her so-called friend. Earlier that morning, Emma had decided she'd go for a ride on her own, if the weather was fine. After all, it was one of the reasons she had come here in the first place. There was also every chance she might meet Jack. He had mentioned he kept a horse at the stables and rode most mornings. But of course, Jill wanted to go too. Emma had no choice but to agree. She decided to make a real effort to be friendly. Jack's Land Rover was at the stables, and that was enough to get Jill smiling and Emma almost backsliding into irritation again. But she was determined to control her emotions, at least for the duration of the ride. The day was too good, and the horses they had hired too beautiful to spend time fuming over Jill and moping over Jack. Their usual city riding was both expensive and unsatisfying, but it was usually all they could get, so it'd be such a treat riding in this glorious countryside. And the horses, alert and responsive, they seemed as keen as Emma and Jill to be off. United again by a common pleasure, however short-lived it might be, the girls rode out into the early summer morning along lanes with blessedly untrimmed hedgerows. They'd been told where to find open pasture and fields where they could give the horses their heads. They flew along with the sun in their faces and exhilaration in their voices as they called their delight to each other. Jack appeared over the brow of the hill and rode down to join them, neither was surprised. Both had hoped he would be around. But their camaraderie was immediately shattered. They were competitors again. Jill rushed straight in, of course, pointedly asking Jack how he was that morning, as if the evening before may have left him exhausted. Emma felt the smile setting on her face. Jill was trying to push her aside, leaving no space in the conversation for her to join in. Desperately, she struggled to find something to say, something witty or funny or clever. But before she could, Jill was riding off with Jack. But not alone, if Emma could help it. When it came to horsemanship, she was as good as Jill any day. But horses, like cars, can let you down, just when you need them most. Emma's mount had gone lame. Furious with herself for putting her horse at risk simply to beat Jill, she dismounted to examine his leg. She was no expert, but she couldn't risk riding any further in case she did more harm. The others paused, but Jill seized her chance and demanded that Jack follow her.
Come on, Jack.
With only a moment's hesitation, he apparently made his choice. As he spurred his horse after Jill, Emma was left to trudge home, the fight knocked out of her, wearily resigned to the certainty of Jill's victory. The beauty of the day was lost to her now, as lost to her as Jack was. With every step of the long walk home, Emma seethed and railed against the injustice of it all. Why hadn't Jill's horse gone lame? But if it had, she could never have ridden off, leaving Jill to walk back alone. Some friend she was. As she neared the road, the sound of an approaching Land Rover cut across her thoughts. Her heart leapt as she realized it was Jack's Land Rover. He had come back, and he was alone. He'd only left her to go for the horse box, not to keep Jill company. Emma couldn't believe how she could go from despair to delight in seconds. Trying to stay calm, she led the horse into the box. She wanted a little time to compose herself. She dared not sit beside him in the cab, not while she was still shaking. So she insisted that she must ride with the horse to keep it from panicking. She seemed so concerned that Jack hadn't the heart to refuse. He drove the short distance with more than usual care, as Emma revelled in his obvious concern for her. That evening, Jack came round as promised to take Emma to see the barn owl. He brought with him a present for her, a beautifully illustrated book about owls. As Jill watched them together, she recognized at once the growing intimacy between them. But she was not beaten yet. Pushy as ever, she invited herself to join them.
Wait for me.
Tell her she can't come, Emma silently begged Jack. But he was too nice a person for that. Flying down the path after them came Jill, pulling on her brightest jacket, squeezing in beside Emma and wondering just where she had lost the advantage. The barn was close by, no more than 5 minutes in the Land Rover. Emma, sitting beside Jack, felt as close to happiness as she could with the competition breathing down her neck. She listened intently as Jack told her more about the owl and how important it was to stay still and quiet while they waited for it to hunt. Jill hadn't said a word since they left the cottage, but she was only recharging her batteries. She hadn't realized that her outfit couldn't have been less suitable for blending in with her surroundings, and she still had no idea that she was there under sufferance, that neither Emma nor Jack really wanted her there. She tried to divert Jack's attention to herself, asking questions and turning the full power of her eyes directly on him. For Emma, it was almost too much. Jill was pulling out all the stops in a last-ditch attempt to ruin Emma's chances with Jack. But it didn't work. In a final, desperate bid, she ran her fingers down his leg. What Emma couldn't see was that Jack was not playing. He was only able to be civil to Jill for Emma's sake. But she just wouldn't be quiet. Eventually, even Jack lost his temper with her. Poor Jill. She'd finally met someone who was not impressed by her. Retreat was her only course of action, leaving Emma to take a place beside Jack. They waited in companionable silence, engrossed in each other. Jill finally forgotten. Into the intimacy of the moment, with a whisper of wings, the barn owl floated around the corner of the building, so close that Emma could feel the disturbance of air. She followed it with eyes full of wonder, eyes that turned again to Jack. All the doubts and uncertainties vanished as Jack looked at her with such love that she felt her insides melt. Emma knew at last she was where she belonged.